the National Infrastructure Commission report was launched on Thursday. It was a 54-page report, which was a conclusion of, or its main conclusion was a new framework for resilience in the country for its energy, water, digital, road and rail infrastructure to be able to cope with shocks and stresses. And I'm sure you'll appreciate the report was written in large part before COVID, but we're fascinated to hear what the report says and Sir Richard's comments, John's comments afterwards. So John, all over to you.
Right, thank you, Robert, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to have this opportunity to introduce our report to you. With me today, I've got Tom Hughes and Francis Heal of the NIC, who have been heavily involved in the preparation of this report. If I said inevitably there'll be probably some detailed questions later on, which I might struggle with, and at that point I'll be happy to hand over to Tom or Francis, because this report has been quite a long time in the making. This is a report which we kicked off for some 18 months ago, at least in 2018. We commenced it with a public consultation, and of course one of the key questions for anyone is, well, what do you mean by resilience? And so getting under the skin of what resilience means to people through social research can be quite useful. People's expectations of infrastructure, and of course those which they've spent their lives just flicking a switch or turning a tap, they have very high levels of expectation of. More recent infrastructure, such as digital comms, maybe we're a little more tolerant of that going down. Although I think during the last 8 weeks, of course, our dependency on that has been massive. And to be fair, I think it's there have been a few outages. I think it's stood up pretty well. We did a call for evidence back in September 2019, seeking views from people. How they felt about it across the board, of course, as always with NIC reports, through academics, through the sectors responsible for our utilities and our infrastructure, and through the general public. So whenever we do these calls for evidence, we try and get as wider feedback as we possibly can. In the meantime, in October 2019, we published also our report on regulation. And in that report, we, for the first time, talked about the need for regulators to have part of their armory when dealing with the infrastructure utility companies, to have a level of expectation from them on resilience. And this report, in addition to Ofwat, Ofgem, and Ofcom, brings in for the first time road and rail. The team modelled different types of interdependency between the networks. They had a look at how decisions are made nationally across the different infrastructure sectors, levels of service which are normally provided and which people expect, and indeed the degree to which the suppliers themselves have their own view on the level of service that they're trying to achieve. And of course, they looked at different case studies and literary review. I think moving on to the next slide, you can now see the key three recommendations that that we made. I'll just pull them up myself. So moving on to the three recommendations, which is the next one. That's it. Sorry, I'm I'm leaping ahead of my own slides here. So key messages, which was a framework to drive the action to, in a sense, have to face up. So we move on to the next one, which is key messages. That's it. A framework which, in part, leads us to face up to some uncomfortable truths. One of the uncomfortable truths, of course, is that resilience doesn't come cheap. And that if we want to have a higher level of resilience, then there is inevitably going to be a price to be paid for that. And I think coming back to our discussion, that's going to be one of the key issues, is where's the balance to be struck between what we expect as resilience and what the public expects, and equally what is affordable in the minds of different parties. So in that context, we need to value resilience and understand how we value it. And of course, we also need to be able to test and address the vulnerabilities in the system. This is very much a matter for the regulators and the suppliers of our infrastructure. And the world is changing all the time. Climate change is having different impacts on our infrastructure. And so we're going to have to constantly be looking at how we adapt our systems before it's too late. So there are three key recommendations which we have made. And it's interesting that in preparing this, and it's a little bit like all our aspects of infrastructure, what is the role of government? And how involved should government get? And as the National Infrastructure Commission, a number of our studies and works which we've carried out, we've finished up coming back and saying to ourselves and saying to the wider world that we think government has a key role in infrastructure, in setting out what the expectations are, what the standards are that should be achieved across our infrastructure. And so here we find ourselves once again saying we think in the first place it's down to government to say, well, what are the resilience standards which we should expect? And that they should set those out every 5 years in the same way as the NIC, we publish an assessment of our infrastructure requirements every 5 years. So number one, for the government departments, working with regulators, working with industry, to understand what are the appropriate resilience standards which as a country we should expect. Having set those standards, we then need to know that they can be achieved, they can be met, and the infrastructure operators will therefore need to carry out stress testing of their system on a regular and sensible basis to make sure that their systems are actually capable of meeting these standards. And then again, with the operators, they should develop and maintain long-term resilience strategies. So having got used to the whole concept of a resilient standard, having set up a system of testing and being able to stress test it, you don't just stop there. You continue to look forward, you look at the changing world, and you think about what are your longer-term resilient strategies. And that, of course, will feed straight back into the debates which take place with the regulators as to what's going to be the cost of those new strategies and what is affordable, and that constant tension between regulators and suppliers in terms of, well, what is affordable, what gives a return to the supplier, and how do we get those things to balance, because at the end of the day, there will be trade-offs to be had across these challenges. So moving on to the next slide, which is recommendation number one, comes back to this issue of facing uncomfortable truths. But the key thing about the standards is that they should provide some clarity and transparency. It's the government's role, as I say, to set these standards. Those setting and meeting of those standards is going to, in the early days, I'm sure, going to be a challenge. There'll be those levels of resilience which people are working to at the moment, but how do those look in the future? Where should we expect to see a greater level of resilience in the system? Because all the time coming back, I think, to, well, what is seen as being an acceptable level of service? And as we've seen, I think, over recent years, people's expectation of these standards will inevitably constantly be driven up. So moving on to the next one, which is recommendation 2, resist, absorb and recover. This in a sense is, well, how do we resist the challenges? Some of these vulnerabilities are inevitably not going to be easy to see. The 2019 power cut, which many of us will remember, created a whole series of issues. It was a power cut in the end, which didn't last for very long. But one totally unforeseen outcome of that was occurred on the railways, where in fact, I think it was a Thameslink train, a Siemens train, which was a relatively new train. When it stopped because it lost its power, was unable to restart from within the cab by the driver, and engineers had to be brought out with all the attendant delays and upheaval, which immediately became the main story. Toddbrook Dam is an interesting one, because here is a dam which has been standing there for a very, very long time. But then, due to the very, very heavy rains, was in danger of overtopping the village below it. Part of the dam on the downside then started to crack up, and the spillway was not capable of dealing with the volume of water, and so there had to be a major exercise. The inquiry, interestingly, looking at it, determined that in fact the original design was incapable of dealing with the volume of water. But maybe when it was designed, there was a different expectation of the level of water rainfall which could be expected compared with what we have today. So again, you come back to that point about constantly re-examining your infrastructure and determining whether it's capable of resisting changing weather patterns and changing usage levels. So you then come back to the stress test and the need for the stress testing to be carried out on a regular basis, and being one which everybody's involved in, being transparent, but one which actually recognises that circumstances have changed, and therefore a stress test which may have been fine 5 years ago is still appropriate today. So, as ever, the operators, the utility companies, are going to be the ones who have to do that, rather like the banks being responsible for their stress testing of their systems, but the regulator, financial authorities in terms of the banks, and the normal regulators in terms of infrastructure. Moving on to the next slide, which is recommendation 3. Go on, that's it. So this is the one about looking forward, adapting, transforming, long-term resilience strategy, addressing issues proactively rather than waiting to be hit by the unexpected. And when we're adding on to our infrastructure, when we're maintaining it or when we're improving it, always that opportunity to enhance it by building back better, taking account of the changes which we can see on demand and the changing pressures which our infrastructure is going to face. It's going to require an open mind. It's going to require recognition of the fact that we can't be absolute about what the future holds, and it will, an early point, come back to this balance between, well, do we take the most extreme unforeseen circumstance and try and design and plan for that, or in fact would that prove to be gold plating in Treasury's language, and have we got to find a more median level of resilience, which is one which is acceptable. And this, of course, I think is going to open up, as we're seeing, I think, more and more these days in the language of infrastructure, is that discussion and that debate which we have with the public, and the need to make the public aware of what it is that is regarded as being the necessary level of resilience, getting public to buy into that as part of the discussion about, well, if that's what we're going to do, guys, then there's a price to pay for this, and that's going to be fed through to charges. At the same time, the inevitable pressure will be put on the regulator, back on the operators to keep their costs down, to be more efficient, and they in turn will feed back into consulting and contracting organisations in the sector to say to them, well, come on, guys, how can you be more efficient and more effective in what's being delivered? So moving on from recommendation 3, we come to, where we come to? Well, probably some conclusions. Very simple to describe what we're trying to set out here, which is set some standards, agree what those standards are going to be, then have a system which enables you to test your systems, to stress test them, to make sure that they're capable of meeting those standards, discuss and debate the choices which are then faced in reaching those standards. Some of the uncomfortable truths, of course, will be thinking about challenges which we've not thought about before. The one which I think probably is the most uncertain is just to what extent are our systems going to be exposed to cyber attack, and what could be the consequences of cyber attack on our systems. Those are going to be difficult discussions. As I say, some of them probably uncomfortable for everyone involved. If we don't have them, if we don't at least address the threats and challenge and how we might deal with it, then we're inevitably going to be sooner or later embarrassed when it occurs, and we're not capable of dealing with it. So that comes on, of course, to well, there are a lot of costs, but what do we value? What is the value of the resilience that we're trying to achieve? How is that understood? Do people recognise it? I mean, I don't want to go into the whole COVID debate, but you can see how more intensive care beds during recent weeks at the early stage would have actually given the NHS more resilience. What's now being put in place clearly provides resilience for the future, as long as we decide to keep the Nightingale units up and running, or do those have to be sort of transferred in future into other hospital facilities? So a relatively straightforward example, I think, of resilience in the system, and how, rather than have to do it at the last minute, it needs to be thought of in advance, which is this whole issue of proactively testing and planning, and then taking the opportunities to adapt as and when those opportunities arise, which again is going to be part of this ongoing, continuous discussion, I'm sure, between regulators and the industry as to what can the industry afford, what can the industry charge, what's going to be the cost of providing this new resilience, and trying to find, and I suspect we'll never precisely find, that right balance of cost, benefit, and a proper understanding of the resilience challenge and how we're going to meet that resilience challenge going forward. It's never going to be a done and dusted exercise. This is one which will require constant updating and taking on. And, every 5 years is what we've proposed in this report, and those 5 years, of course, are going to come around quite quickly. In the first place, we're setting some quite early challenges for government in the report, if anybody's had a chance to read it. So we're saying by the end of 2021, we would expect government to have determined what the standards should be, and by 2022, we should have the first sort of understanding of how the industry is going to respond to that, and what the stress testing is going to have to be put in place are likely to be. So by 2023, 24, we should be up and running with a proper system. So I'll stop there. I think that's been about 15, 20 minutes, and happy to open it up to discussion. Thank you.
So, John, thank you very much indeed for a very clear expose of the report, and I do hope people take time and trouble to read it, because it's a very interesting read. I don't think we can communicate with Richard. Richard, are you there at all? No. So let me continue through two-way conversation at the moment before we open it to the floor, if I may. Appreciated, you just mentioned the pandemic and the Nightingale hospital, but as the bulk of the report was written before COVID struck, in hindsight, a wonderful thing, would you have changed anything significant in the report? Would you have highlighted and reinforced it, or would you have removed anything in the light of the experience we've had over the last 4 months? What did it think?
Well, I think probably diplomatically and sensibly, we would have tried to resist diving into a sector which, frankly, at the end of the day, is not one which we claim to have a lot of expertise in. The National Health Service is an element of social infrastructure. As the NIC, we focus on physical infrastructure. So personally, I don't think it would have been wise of us to try and dive in. And if we'd been in the middle of this report, for example, at the moment, to dive in and start trying to extract examples and lessons from COVID. I think that, as we've seen, the challenge with COVID has been the degree of, and I think this is why it's been so difficult for politicians, is you can have 25 experts around the table. As we know, whether it's 25 experts on structural engineering design, or indeed on flood management, 25 experts will disagree on what the solutions are likely to be. It's really been a big challenge in the health sector, particularly one where you've got not just the UK experience to take into account. This is a worldwide pandemic, and every country with different experiences, learning from different approaches which it's taken. And I would imagine the shakedown of what can be learned from COVID is going to provide researchers and analysts with a lot of work for several years yet.
Yeah, indeed.
I think it would have been a challenge for us to try and build to that.
But I think in many ways it has reinforced some of your conclusions of the need for resilience. Yes. So actually, in many ways, sadly, the disease has struck, but it's beneficial to reinforce some of those messages.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
Okay, you talked about clear, resilient standards set up by government and regulators to be reviewed every 5 years. Do you expect these standards to be generic or very industry specific? And can they be assessed through independent evidence, through some government body or through some independent body? How do you see that assessment being made?
Well, I'm never a great fan of setting up new bodies. And ideally, I think that assessment ought to be made between the consumer organizations, for example, who represent what it is that the consumer expects and how the consumer sees resilience, the people who are in business to supply a system, and then those who are there to, if you like, mark the homework and in a sense provide that pressure. I mean, why do we have the regulators? Because to a large extent, although there is competition in the sectors, it's difficult to get competition in the water sector. It's easier to get competition in digital and telecoms. And energy, as we've seen, has been quite a challenge with many newcomers into that sector, struggling to get into a sector which is being traditionally governed by originally by one organisation, but in privatisation, as like so many privatisations, starts off with multi-headed number of organisations and then shrinks down to maybe half a dozen key organisations, simply because of the sheer volume of the sheer level of capital that has to be invested. So for me, rather than going out and setting up a new organisation, I would rather see the regulators, and of course here we've got the issue of interdependency of these systems and how a failure in one system, one utility, can have other. But then we've got the UK Regulators Network, which has been set up to try and get better understanding and cross debate and discussion between the regulators and the different utility sectors. But in the first place, the understanding of, well, what am I able to deliver in terms of resilience? The greatest understanding will sit with those who design their systems, built their systems, and operate them on a daily basis. I mean, National Grid clearly is the place to go if you're wanting to understand, well, just how does the system cope with things when they go wrong. And as we've heard on many occasions, it's the balancing of the electricity network is something which is it's not something which you set at 3 o'clock in the morning and then go off for tea for the rest of the day. This is something which requires constant fine tuning as the weather changes, the level of demand changes, and that I think is going to become more challenging, less. So I see how you develop those standards as having to be a cross-party discussion, if you like, between the key actors and the person who's on the receiving end, the consumer, potentially probably represented by those organisations which have been set up over the years to represent consumer interest.
Right. Yeah, that's clear. Thank you. And the last question to you directly before I open it up to the floor. You talked about long-term resilient strategies. If company boards are going to apply this, do you see some form of accountability, some sort of legal requirement on boards or NEDs in the application or design and application of those strategies? It's some sort of compunction to their application. Otherwise, it may be an optional choice and they'll probably refuse or decline to do it if they don't have to. So how do you sort of encourage and compete with it?
Well, that comes back to the visibility, in a sense, I think, of the regulator and the regulator's reports. I mean, when I was at Network Rail and I was on the receiving end of the ORR in those days, their pressures and their criticisms and their critiques of us as Network Rail, I can recall saying, look, fining me is all very well and good, but I actually had a turnover of, I don't know, umpteen £billion. A £50 million fine doesn't actually make any, it's almost in the loose change an organisation of that scale. What really does impact me is the embarrassment of you calling me out and saying that you as the chief executive or you as a board of directors at Network Rail are failing in your duty to recognise and deal with the challenges which are expected for you to meet in order to provide a decent rail service. And I think that has always been there, it continues to be there. Adding another 3 pages, I can imagine, to the annual report is going to become part of this. So, you know, we all, in the last 15, 20 years, any of us in the corporate world have seen our annual report triple in thickness with all the duties which are placed upon us and we're expected to report upon. Yes, that does have an effect, and if you're going to have to report on something and you want to make sure that you can be truthful and honest about what you're reporting and you've got the systems in place to deliver that. But none of us go out in the mornings wanting to fail in the service that we provide. And the board of directors always will acutely feel that. And in today's world of Twitter and all the other things, if you slip up, the world and his wife knows fairly quickly. So there's no shortage of pressures on an organisation.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. Well, let me start now by asking some questions that have come in from the audience. And one picked up your point about resilience doesn't come cheap. And I think we all understood exactly what you mean by that. But is there not an argument, and it's being put forward here on the screen, that actually there's a lot we can do in advance that doesn't actually cost anything in terms of preparatory work, taking a measured horizon scanning view of the environment and looking what things can be done. And then hence the danger is that if we put too much of a cost label on it, we detract from some of the very inexpensive things that we can do. And I'm not saying you don't, we're not advocating that, but I think there's a balance between what it costs and what can be done.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, that comes back to any service provision of what is good and day-to-day effective management to make sure that you know, at the beginning of that day everything can start off as planned and can meet the service levels that are required in a relatively simple way. And Chairman of National Express, now, you know, we have thousands of buses and coaches across the world, which every morning at sort of 5 o'clock need to be up and running, and there will be as far as we're concerned, a level at which we're prepared to have buses standing around which aren't going to be used that day, but which are in reserve, if you like, for problems which may occur. But the key thing is that you've got a team of, you know, you've got a decent maintenance team that have been working through the night to make sure that things are ready, and you've got your drivers coming in sufficiently ahead of time to make sure that their vehicles are ready to start up, and they can start them up and get them to the, you know, to the start of their day on time. all of that is part of the normal management which would be going on in any large utility, in which you're looking forward at your known challenges and making sure that your system is resilient, in inverted commas, but quite simply operable for that day to meet the service levels required of it. It's when you start to say, well, one of the challenges we have all the time, of course, is, I think we're seeing it now as we come out of COVID, is that if we're not careful, we move ourselves to a level where zero failure or zero risk is the standard which people start to expect, because they become worried about anything other than zero risk. And I think this is going to be the really challenging aspect of how we develop standards and to what level we're prepared to accept a level of risk, which doesn't mean we have to spend a lot more money, but there will be levels of resilience which inevitably are going to require extra investment in the system to make sure that it can meet those challenges. I mean, again, coming back to my railway experience, and very simple way people used to say, well, the Japanese railway was more resilient and more reliable than the UK railway. But when you looked at it, you find they've got high levels of redundancy built into the Japanese system. So if the solenoid went down on a set of points, then in fact there was a backup solenoid which automatically was able to take over. So you're doubling up in order to reduce that risk of the system failure. And so the debate always is, well, do you want to spend that extra money, or do you want to just have a better maintenance system? Because I think one of the challenges for us in resilient infrastructure is that in all organisations, one of the first things which is likely to get cut is current expenditure rather than capital expenditure. And local authorities have this struggle all the time. Government has this challenge all the time. Today's expenditure, current expenditure, tends to be the one which is looked at first. But that, by and large, is the money that's going on maintenance. If you don't maintain your systems adequately, then they're more likely to fail. The last time, 2007, when we had the severe drought, the floods, I was flooded. I went to a village hall meeting a few months later for discussions with the Highways Authority, in which I asked the question, well, the flood occurred to us because, in fact, the culvert under the road was blocked. How often do you, in your maintenance program with the Highways Agency, go and unblock these or check that these culverts are free? Answer, we don't. Answer, we wait for them to fail.
Yeah, simple measures.
Indeed.
I
sat there, my jaw dropped. We don't wait for them to fail. But
that's a good example. Thank you. Yeah, let me change the topic to climate and the green recovery. A question which you may want to ponder on. How serious do you think the government is about stimulating a sustainable green recovery? Or do you think it will go for what is shovel ready without regard to long-term resilience in an effort to get the economy on track? And I'm sure you've heard Mark Carney's recent views on the economic case being so strong that markets will invest in renewable energy, whatever government. What is your reflection on the impetus that will be given to this sustainable green recovery as part of it?
Well, in simplest, of course, we have a new standard which we're all now striving towards, which is zero carbon by 2050. And as long as people can see that government is committed to that, and as long as people can see that government is, through the powers that it has and the challenges and the standards which it sets in different sectors, leading the way in saying, for example, well, we want everybody to be able to go out and buy a electric vehicle by 2030 as their first choice. In order to get people to that point, there will have to be a charging infrastructure. As long as government is showing that it is willing to put the level of subsidy which is required into that infrastructure system, along with the providers of it, then people will say, yeah, the government's really serious about this. If the government steps back and says, well, we'll just wait for the private sector to deal with this, then you start to question the level of seriousness. And that's I would argue, a high risk strategy. So I think the challenge all the time, whether we're talking about renewable energy, whether we're talking about switch to electric vehicles, whether in fact we're looking at how we're going to see a change in emission levels in cities, how government sets out the long-term approach to resolving these issues, which is why the National Infrastructure Strategy is so important in that. It's now nearly 2 years since we published the National Infrastructure Assessment. The government's response to that, they had said very clearly, would be in the form of a National Infrastructure Strategy. There is a real opportunity with that strategy for government to demonstrate that, yes, a green, sustainable set of ideas and solutions going forward are what are going to be, in their mind, needed and should be taking a priority in the development of that strategy. The degree to which it's silent, the degree to which it sort of just talks in platitudes without actually setting a plan and setting out how it expects to support the financing of these things, then people will be more cynical, and therefore we can expect less action, and we won't achieve zero carbon by 2050.
Yeah, indeed. A question here from Atkins, actually. How do you think future training for operators and infrastructure builders will change to take into account the resilient approaches that the report outlines, and including the net zero approach that you just introduced? How far do you think operators are going to have to change and adapt their ways in order to meet what you are recommending?
Well, I mean, that is just simply part of running a business.
Yeah.
And I've always said, the company that doesn't train its people to meet the challenges that company is facing tomorrow and in 5 years' time is a company which frankly deserves to fail. Investing in your people, investing in their skills is to a large extent your fundamental capital investment in your business. If you haven't got teams of people with the right skills to actually deliver what it is that you as a business know you've got to deliver to satisfy your customer, then sooner or later somebody's either going to take you over because you're not getting the value that should be expected from business, or frankly your business will be beaten by the competition. And I think for me this has always been a debate which I've had with those who criticise the takeover of British firms by overseas firms. I mean, to me, this is the law of competition.
Yeah.
And if you're not good enough, and if you're not fulfilling the shareholder expectation because you're not investing in the right way within the business, if you're not investing in training, then sooner or later you'll fail. Don't blame the government for that. So, to my mind, it's simply down to the management of the organisation to make sure that the training in place. I'm chairman of City and Guilds, and we have been having to change our training model over the last 8 weeks because we can't do face-to-face training. So we've been investing in new systems to enable online training. The interesting challenge is going to be over the next year as companies come back, to what extent are companies going to be willing to invest themselves in training for a changed world, which COVID will be. In simple terms, if companies think that it's going to be better to have their staff with the ability to work from home 2 days a week out of 5, then a simple investment is going to be the capital one of, well, do we support them at home with better equipment than they can afford themselves? Do we invest in that way? Other companies in these changing circumstances will have to recognise they've got to give their staff extra training. If you don't give them the extra training, if you don't show them what is required of the new marketplace, then sooner or later you'll be out of business.
Yeah. Okay. Let me change the topic, if I may, to levelling up, the government's term of levelling up the North. Do you anticipate the levelling up agenda for the North and other parts being central to resilience across public works, given the many transportation and utility and energy facilities dating back to the Victorian era? Where do you see the levelling up taking place in a more resilient?
Well, I mean, the resilient. I mean, what was going through my mind when I was pausing was, for example, the experience of Yorkshire Water some years ago. But what you're doing there, of course, is simply looking at your geography of the UK and saying, well, which are the parts of the country which are going to be most exposed? We know the parts of the country which are most exposed to, likely to be most exposed to drought. Now, those are as much in the northeast as they are in the southeast on previous experience. So the investment needs to be made relative to that challenge. And the levelling up agenda is a much broader challenge, I think, than simply resilience. I mean, to the degree to which, by improving transport connectivity east-west between the northern cities, you are building new infrastructure and more reliable infrastructure, then you're going to import a higher level of resilience to the service. But I think in the first place, you've got to be deciding to make those investments. Another challenge which we've set for government is to actually devolve more of the infrastructure decisions to the major cities around the country, devolve the money to them to spend, because arguably it's at a local level where people have the best understanding of the challenges which they face. If you're talking about Severn Trent or Thames Water or Yorkshire Water, whoever it might be, that debate about, well, what is the level of service, what is the level of resilience that we expect in that area, then that ought to be a discussion between the authorities in that part of the country and the regulator and, of course, the service provider. It shouldn't necessarily be central government that's having to drive that. I think the evolution of these infrastructure forward strategies is going to be very important. So it's all part of that much broader debate about. I mean, levelling up isn't down to infrastructure alone. Levelling up is an investment challenge, it's a skills challenge, as well as an infrastructure challenge, and all of those three things need to be moving in a sense in harmony if you're going to get a real improvement in the productivity and the opportunity which is available in those parts of the country which have been left behind.
Yeah. Well, as you might imagine, there are a few questions with HS2 in that, but we won't go down that particular route. That was behind some of the questions. Let me shift from an interesting one to an interesting one on capital expenditure for resilient infrastructure. What's your view on where the balance between public and private finance should sit in the conversation of
well, I come back in the first place to saying that what's the outcome that we're trying to achieve? The outcome that we're trying to achieve is a reliable utility service in the different sectors to the consumer. Personally, I believe that the private sector generally will provide a more cost-effective and more efficient service than the public sector. I think the things which drive private sector companies to perform, their rigorous desire to control their costs, their drive to increase their revenues, to look at ways in which they can attract people to buy more of the service which they are seeking to sell. All of that, I think, it works better in the private sector than it does in the public sector. And when it comes to investing, um, in a way, because the government comes back to the degree to which you allocate revenue to the provision of the service, which government's always reluctant to do. It likes to take all the money into the centre and then reallocate it, and not hypothecate it to the source of the income. But generally speaking, if you're in the private sector, then you've got a revenue stream which is coming in from what you're selling, and that enables you to then borrow against that revenue stream, and to be able to invest new, fresh capital and to attract other people to put more equity into the business, whatever way it is that you're raising your capital. The government has to decide whether it's going to hypothecate the revenue straight back out to the service it wishes to provide through the taxation it's received from that service, or whether it takes it into a big pot and then sits down tries to distribute all the taxation revenue that it's received back into different sectors. I think a classic example of where that's proving most challenging is nuclear at the moment, where clearly it's not sustainable for the private sector to invest in nuclear power, and it's looking for a deal with government in which government comes in with it and provides government sourced capital, or takes the risk of the revenue stream, or takes the risk if in fact allows the nuclear distributor to have a lower collar cap on the revenue that you can expect, so that he knows he's going to get his money back. And unfortunately, in the last few years, we've seen private finance initiatives and they fall into disrepute. And I think a challenge which remains for us going forward is how do we recover that situation? How do we learn from what was seen as what didn't work in the old private finance initiative? Because to my mind, getting a balance between where it's appropriate for the public sector to invest in, say, the rural bus service, for example. There is not a good private sector economic case for running a rural bus service. So if the country wants to have a rural bus service, where there's very low ridership, and otherwise, if you want to get people out of their cars or having to own a car, and the elderly not wanting to drive a car, you need a local bus service. Who's going to pay for it? Well, that has to become the public sector if in fact there is no revenue stream which enables a private sector investor to do it. So, there's no simple solution to this. I think the private sector by and large is more efficient, more effective, but there will be situations where we want a social service to be provided to society and where government should step in.
Yeah, thank you. Well, one last question. You've been very patient and thank you for answering them so clearly. But one last question is, in your preparatory work on the report, I'm sure that your team looked at other international experiences of how they did infrastructure resilience. And this is not a COVID question, but clearly, we're learning from other countries in this dilemma on other countries' experiences. So, to remove that, look more widely at other countries. How would you rate the UK in its resilience for its infrastructure compared to other countries, whether that be European or American or what? Good or bad are we, do you think?
Well, my personal view, and I'll hand over to Francis or Tom in a moment, but my personal view is that we're typically British when it comes to our infrastructure. We're very critical. We don't sort of say, oh, we're brilliant at something. We're much more inclined to say as a nation, oh, we're not really quite good enough here, are we? My personal experience of travelling around the world is that the British infrastructure by and large is very good. And in my conversations, again, going back to my rail days when I met my counterparties from around the world, they all had the same problems as we had. In Germany, at National Express, we run 3 rail franchises. We were welcomed with open arms by the German public when we went out to run these train services in Germany, because the German public actually do not have a very high opinion of Deutsche Bahn and the quality of service that they get from Deutsche Bahn. The average British person would probably think, "Oh, the Germans are, their rail service, I'm sure, is super efficient and much better than ours." Go and talk to a German, and you'll get a very different perspective. But let me ask Francis or Tom whether they'd like to add anything to the work that they've done. I'm assuming they're on the call, by the way.
Not sure they are to be able to answer that question. So we can pick it up subsequently if you like. I don't think they're on the call now.
Yes, I haven't. I confess I haven't trawled through the bibliography of the report to look at all the different places that we went to for evidence. I'm certainly expecting to be on the call yesterday. Maybe they struggled to get into it. But as I say,
Okay.
my overall. Did I hear somebody then? No. No, I'd say my overall impression would be. At the end of the day, you have to talk about your own personal experience, don't you? And mine is mostly in the transport sector, and in the transport sector, the two most intensely run railway systems in the world, probably at a national level, are our own, and particularly in and around the southeast, and Holland, which has a similar level of intensity of its network, and performance levels, generally speaking, very, very comparable. Other countries I know have always faced the same challenge between their core network and their secondary networks. I can remember a head of SNCF saying to me once, "I've got to go back to France tomorrow and put on a load of speed restrictions because I can't get the same level of investment out of the government to support the network on the secondary network as I can from my TGV network," which is sort of seen as the old ribbon of the French railways, and therefore the investment tends to be pushed towards that, and the secondary network and the reliability of the secondary network suffers as a consequence. But I mean, when we look at the extremes that we face as a country, which one of the incidents we reference in the report is Katrina in America. And if ever you wanted a demonstration of an absolutely major calamity, far greater than anything we've seen in this country, and again, of course, what's really been a challenge for America was the recovery from that level of investment that's required to recover. Who was responsible for the levies? To what extent was there a resilience plan for the levies? I don't know. But I mean, it's a great example of just how badly things can be caught out by nature. It's interesting, as I said last week, we're about to launch this resilience reports, and are we about to get a hose pipe ban at the same time?
Indeed.
Our report.
Yeah. Well,
plenty of recommendations from the NIC over the last couple of years about what we should do in our water supply sector to increase the resilience of it by reducing leakage, by building new capacity, and of course by reducing demand through the greater use of water meters, which might not be popular with everyone, but which is bound to be a way in which you get people's attraction and make them realise what they're using and what it costs.
Yeah. Well, so John, we're coming to the end of the hour. It behoves me, in the absence of our chair, and he apologises profusely for the communication drop this morning. But thank you so much for taking your time out of a busy diary to address us this morning. It really is more than I can do to summarise the ground we've covered, but I would like to just repeat what the report says, because I think these 4 points are really quite telling, and you have covered them, but I sort of summary would like to summarise them. One is that we need to better anticipate future shocks and stresses by facing up to uncomfortable truths. Well, whether that's COVID or anything else, I think anticipation, horizon scanning is an absolutely essential commodity and doesn't cost us a lot. Secondly, that we need to improve our actions to resist, absorb, and recover from shocks and stresses by testing for vulnerabilities. Thirdly, we should value resilience properly, and that's understanding it as well as valuing it. And lastly, to drive adaptation. So, really good conclusions, I think, from the session today. So on behalf of us all, thank you very much, Sir John, for your time, and for we will be circulating a summary of this and your slides in due course. Before I close, I'd just like to make two brief important announcements. Firstly, that Atkins, who very kindly partnered with us this morning, and Resilience First are working together on a project that will look at urban resilience UK regions, with a series of reports and webinars looking at aspects of devolution, decarbonisation, and urban resilience. So please watch out for that. We're looking forward very much to working with Atkins on it. And secondly, we launched our own report, a much smaller report, I must admit, on a guide for the new world, rather than the new order. And this looks at resilient solutions to many challenges, those uncomfortable truths, if you like, posed by crises like COVID, but I'm sure there will others be coming down the track. So I will close by hoping that you join us again on the 17th of June for our next webinar on the internet, our backbone of coping with COVID, and all it does to conclude by thanking John again and to you for tuning in. Thanks indeed. Goodbye.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you to Atkins for co-hosting this. Thank you for such a good summary at the end. Main points.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.